And I want to make mention of three, especially a 12-year-old, and their names are Miguel Miranda, Lionel Miranda, Antonio Soltero, and Miguel Mendoza. And these are all young people that took their lives because they thought that they were hopeless, that there was no hope for them to stay in this country, the country they were raised in. And I want to be mindful that this isn't just an issue of like status, this is an issue of identity, it's an issue of family, it's an issue of really, there's two main reasons why people come to the US. They're either fleeing they're economic refugees, or they're political refugees, right? And so if you take a look at the history of the US in terms of foreign policy, you see migration patterns coming based on that trajectory, that history. And so I just want to be really mindful that when we talk about young people, we're talking about people who bring their whole selves and their entire selves, and when their needs aren't getting met, and there's not avenues for them to have, oftentimes they lose hope. And that's what we don't want. And I think this is what the movement has proven to so many that have seen it through, is that there is hope, but you just got to fight for it. Nothing's given to you. You've got to fight for it here. All right. So I want to introduce my panelists. I want to introduce, thank you, Sasha Shane. She's a colleague of mine, and I'll go into more of her bio as she speaks. Charles Philip Baldamara Sanchez, correct? Yes. And he is on the Harvey Milk Democratic Executive Board. He is our treasurer, but I'll also give his bio in a second. And then we have Laura Villegara. I've known you for like 20 years and I always mispronounce your name. And she's the lead civic engagement organizer with people organizing to demand environmental rights. And so I'm going to switch up the order a bit because Laura has to leave to attend to an emergency in this very same field that we're talking about. But I want to give you guys an overview because I think it's really important to root in the history of what led up to this problem. Why is it that young people who are undocumented can't get access to higher education or have access to legal status? So I did a little cheat sheet for you guys, and I hope you can read it, but I'm going to go through it really quick. This is the history. The history really starts even before, I would say, 1982, but these are the key dates that I would say mark this particular history around DACA. In 1982, Plyler versus Doe was a huge Supreme Court case in which it basically gave students who were undocumented access to public education. It said that it doesn't matter what your status is, you have a right to an education. And this coincides with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the international level that also speaks to the fact that everyone has a right to public education. After 82, what started happening is a lot of localities and states started to circumvent this by passing unofficial policies that denied students access to higher education. And in California, this came to a head in the D.A.C.A. case. The D.A.C.A. case was very important because it marked a switch from this particular time where in the 80s we were feeling a lot of rage, we were seeing a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, very similar to today. The D.A.C.A. case allowed for undocumented immigrants in California to access state residency so that they can apply to both the CSU systems and the UC systems. And so this was a huge case in California, but it was all for naught because in '96 we see not only changes in immigration, but we see also the crime bill, we see the Welfare Reform Act. These are bills that criminalize people who are poor for the most part. And for the immigrant community, what it did is, again, amongst many things that it did, including the sharing of interagency information, it set the groundwork for that, which was never the case before. Immigrants were protected under the 1974 Privacy Act, but this basically took that away. But the main thing it did for young people is that it again prohibited in-state tuition from being, or in other words, residency from being determined by states on their own. And it criminalized, for the first time, it criminalized certain aspects of migration. And so this was a big boom for the private prison industry, these laws. How we responded in California, because if you see, California often is leading the way in terms of responding to these negative immigration policies. And one of the things that we did in California is we worked really hard, and this is how I met my dear friend Laura many moons ago, is that we started working on AB 540, which is in-state tuition, redefining what residency was in California, which basically meant that immigrants that were undocumented would have a higher threshold to prove in-state residency than, say, anyone who would transfer from a different state would. And the way that was made was the way it was made. This went into effect right after, actually, 9/11. The Student Adjustment Act, but the issue was still that in California, this might be addressed, in-state tuition for undocumented students, but the rest of the country wasn't. There were slow, piecemeal movements to move different states towards in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants, but the reality is we needed to lift the barriers at the national level. And so that's why first iterations of the DREAM Act were also called the Student Adjustment Act. This was introduced in the House. And the early iterations of the DREAM Act, what I loved about them is that for the Student Adjustment Act, it would be an administrative process. So anyone under 12 years old that didn't have status would automatically be granted status without having to file petitions that were costly. DREAM Act, folks, that was a different threshold for them. These different bills, as time went on, changed in many different ways. Right before the war, because if you notice, 2001 to 2012 was every 2 years this legislation was getting introduced. What I find really important about this piece is that there was still options for people to do it outside of going through education. So say if you had a child that maybe was a different learner, had a difference in learning, and they wouldn't get the traditional California diploma, but they would still get a certificate, completion of secondary education. Those folks then should have a way to also adjust their status, even though they weren't going to go into a higher education field. Or kids who were going to trade school, or kids who maybe didn't want to go to school but wanted to do volunteer hours. So those were options that were put into the bills to help offset the fact that there might not be students who may or may not want to go into higher education. All that changed, of course, come 9/11. 9/11 really marks a huge, obviously yesterday was our anniversary of it, but for the immigrant rights movement, it caused havoc in our communities in many, many ways. The Arab community, Muslim community, just anyone who looked other was quickly rounded up or made to report their status. So some of the evil things that came out of that period with the Patriot Act, the Department of Homeland Security, so a whole new aspect or part of the government was formed, consolidating a lot of what we feared would be consolidated in terms of militarizing the borders. And then also we see a huge number of immigrants being profiled. And really, even U.S. citizens detained at that time. And so a lot of that time was really scary because many people didn't know where their relatives were ending up. We had tons, like S-years, a whole bunch of different programs that came out of that were completely negative. But the one thing I would say, the only bill that kept getting reintroduced, even after 9/11, was the DREAM Act and the Student Adjustment Act. And I gotta say that was only because of the organizing that was happening on the ground that pushed for this legislation to still be alive. Everything else that was pro-immigrant died on 9/11. And right before 9/11, there was a huge surge to legalize, to create a huge legalization program. Where we see the huge kind of anti-immigrant sentiment rise up again, and we see it every 10 years really, is through the Sensenbrenner proposal. And that was the last major proposal. The representative from Wisconsin proposed massive enforcement, massive fencing happening, militarization to the border, required local and state agencies to then collaborate with INS, all these egregious things that we've been fighting ever since. Thank God this never passed, but elements of that still exist in this act that was in '96. In fact, after 9/11, they used many of the parts of the '96 legislation that had never been implemented. For example, the interagency sharing of information, say between whatever agencies, medical agencies or whatever. That had never been done, but post 9/11, it was something that they were creeping out of that bill. The other thing that it did is that I think if you didn't report that you had moved with INS, you'd get dinged for that too. So there was little things that they would use as far as big things as well. This bill was defeated because of broad coalitions. The Sensenbrenner bill was defeated because of broad coalitions that were brought together by labor, immigrant rights, youth, and other forces and other sectors as well. And we saw some of the largest May Day rallies in our country's history come out of the 2006 organizing that was happening in defeat of this bill. Now I want to jump into the failures of the DREAM Act for, I don't know how many, I want to say maybe 5 congressional sessions, if not more. And the most probably tragic one was around 2012. And then I'll let Charles go into how we came about having DACA, because DACA has this particular history. And just to give you a little background on Charles, Charles immigrated from Canada to the US at the age of 12. Or 4? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, it says 2 here. I should have said 2. Charles has not only had to overcome the struggle of being homeless and the possibility of deportation, but he's also coped with the tragic loss of his mother and having to provide for himself and his sister. Despite being presented with these multiple obstacles, Charles has remained committed to owning his own education rights and to ensuring that those in his community have access for a better future. He's a member of the Oakland Library Commission. He's also a member of Aspire. He works tirelessly to improve the lives of those around him. He's been inspired by his experiences as an undocumented Asian and Latinx person living in the US. He aspires to dedicate himself to public service. In 2010, Charles organized with Aspire, the first Pan-Asian undocumented group in the nation, to support the comprehensive immigration reform and the DREAM Acts. And in 2012, he successfully led the group's effort to pass AB 130 and AB 131, which allow for undocumented students to receive public and financial aid in California, and also organized on behalf of Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And he's going to talk more about his work with DACA and that history. Thank you, Thomas.
Great, yeah. So I'm just going to share a little bit more about myself. So I'm born in Canada, in Vancouver, and my mom is from the Philippines, my dad is from El Salvador, and they came to the United States to visit a dying relative, and as they tried to go back to Canada, they were denied entry because of our mixed immigration status. So only my sister and myself have Canadian citizenship, and my parents don't. And so that was raised in Oakland since kindergarten. Today my family's still mixed status. If my mom was still alive, she would still be undocumented. My sister is a deferred action or a DACA recipient. My father has CPS, which is temporary protected status, which is a humanitarian status that's granted to people of certain countries because of, I guess, like humanitarian reasons. And I am a U visa recipient, and so I was a victim of a crime which made me eligible to apply for this visa. And unfortunately, none of my family members ended up taking back off of my application. And so, just like even going back to when I was assaulted, like I remember calling the police, and because I told them I never possessed the California ID because they were asking me for that, I then started to become interrogated, and I remember just feeling really terrified and calling my attorney at the Asian Law Office immediately because I thought that they might arrest me. And I remember hearing stories of immigrants who are victims of crime, and they call the police to report it, and they, because of communication barriers or other things, they get taken in and then just later discover their status and they get put into deportation proceedings. And so there's like a big fear in undocumented communities to even report crimes because of that fear. So yeah, I joined in 2010 after SB 1070 was signed into law in Arizona, which made racial profiling legal there. I remember wanting to become active, and going to my first media rally and just starting to meet a lot of the different community groups that were doing things around immigration reform. That's where I met Immigration Attorneys of the Asian Law Caucus, which was a nonprofit here in San Francisco, and they started the first Pan-Asian undocumented advocacy group, and from there I started to organize for comprehensive immigration reform in 2010, which failed, and so they tried to break up the bill and pass the DREAM Act on its own, which also later failed to pass the Senate by, I think, 5 votes. But
DACA. How did DACA?
yeah, okay. So I guess I kind of wanted to go a little bit into some of the history of like just kind of API immigration, not into great depth, but just some of like big laws that were passed in American history. So in 1790, the Naturalization Act was passed, and that excluded Asian immigrants and other non-white people from becoming naturalized U.S. citizens. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which limited Chinese immigration to the United States and denied them citizenship, but it also validated inhumane attitudes toward Chinese Americans, and they were just seen as not viable as social equals. In 1905, anti-miscegenation laws were passed, and so it outlawed marriages between Caucasians and Mongolians, which is this umbrella term to categorize all Asian people, even though we're not all the same. We don't all have the same language, culture, traditions, whatever. They created this term to put us all in and make it illegal for us to marry Caucasians. In 1913, the California Alien Land Law was passed, and that prohibited Chinese and Japanese from owning land. So these are just kind of like examples of what the United States has done. When they feel like immigrants are a threat, it's like, let's create laws to bar them or to make it just hard for them to either get citizenship or own land or marry, like some of the things that most people have the right to do. In 1923, there was a court case, the United States versus Bagat Sin Din, which ruled that Indians were ineligible for citizenship. So they created these categories like Mongoloids, Caucasians, and in 1923, they were able to prove that scientifically Indians were categorized as Caucasians, and then at some point the courts just ruled you had to be a white Caucasian to be able to naturalize. So it ruled out all the Indians who were scientifically proven that they fall underneath the category of Caucasians. In 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924 was passed, and it banned all immigration from Asian Pacific region and sets up preferences based on national quotas. And so just based on the population of the people who are already here, and later on they ended up making it so that it was based on like previous years' population. So it ended up decreasing the amount of Asian immigration and increasing the amount of like European immigration. In 1924 also, U.S. Border Patrol was introduced, creating a distinction between legal and illegal immigrants. And so that was like when they first, like before there was no such thing as illegal or illegal, and then they created this term. And you'll hear like over and over people just creating different terms to divide communities. In 1934, the Tyne-McDuffie Act was passed, and that was due to widespread opposition to the influx of Filipino agricultural labor. During that time, the United States colonized the Philippines, and so during that time, the Philippine citizens could come to the United States freely, work, marry, things like that, and go back home. But during that time, because they saw immigrants as a threat and they saw Filipino laborers as a threat, they passed this law so that they were like, we'll give you independence in 10 years, but in return, you don't get to move back and forth freely like, we're going to limit your immigration to 50 per year, you just lose all of your rights and privileges. In 1942, our country incarcerated a lot of Japanese Americans, and that was an instance of writing discrimination into our law. In the 1960s, some social scientists began to problematically label Asian Americans as a model minority. So this is another instance of our country creating this divisive narrative, illegal, legal. These are the model minorities, like creating division within people of communities of color. And you kind of see that even in today's narrative with immigration reform. We kind of center it a lot on meritocracy. These are the dreamers, they deserve to be here. Dreamers are considered folks who can have the privilege to even go to college. The DREAM Act, I think in the previous iterations, had some kind of condition that you had to attend 2 years of college or attend 2 years of military service. And you know, it's either communities of color are put in the military or you have enough money to support yourself through college.
I will interject that the first iterations had a community service component that a lot of the advocates pushed to get on there, where kids wouldn't have to go to college or the military. They could do 950 hours worth of community service work and get their legal status. And they, Mr. Sessions, all those folks that are now leading the Trump administration were the ones that are ardent to take those options out.
In 1965, the Immigration Act of 1965 ended Asian exclusion and preferences based on discriminatory national quotas. We're getting closer to 2000.
Yes.
I promise. In 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed, which required employers to attest to their employees' immigration status, made it illegal to knowingly hire or recruit unauthorized immigrants, and it granted amnesty to certain seasonal agricultural immigrants, and granted amnesty to immigrants who entered the United States before January 1st, 1982, and have resided there continuously, and have resided there continuously since 1982. So it was kind of like the first amnesty that we've seen in the United States. But although that was a great thing for the community span, it didn't really solve the actual problem with the immigration laws, like them not actually being changed since the 1800s, the early 1900s. And it provided amnesty to I think 3 million immigrants, but it didn't do anything to solve the influx of undocumented immigration into the country. Or even recognizing why people are leaving the countries that they're in to begin with, and how our involvement in other people's countries lead to them leaving their country for other economic opportunity. In 1996, the Immigration Reform Act of 1996 was passed, and that stated that for every year past the age of 18 that you're here, so if you're here unlawfully after the age of 18, between half a year and 1 year, if you ever leave the country, if you ever leave the country, you're banned from returning for 3 years. If you're here for more than 1 year unlawfully past the age of 18, if you ever leave the country, you're banned from returning for 10 years. And so, unfortunately, when my family immigrated here, and we weren't able to go back to Canada because my parents are citizens there, that put them through immigration proceedings, and we were actually issued orders of deportation when I was 4 years old. My sister was 5, and my mother and father were even struggling to figure out what was going on. And so, because I am able to get a visa, I was able to get a pardon. So if I ever lived in the country, I wouldn't be subject to that ban. For my sister, as a DACA recipient, if even she gets married, that would not solve her immigration problem, because she would have to go back to Canada to fix her papers, and once she leaves,
And wait.
it triggers the 10-year ban, and so she wouldn't be able to come back. My dad is protected because he has TPS, and so he, because he's a Salvadoran national, he doesn't have to worry about the ban.
Charles, can you go into a little bit
Yeah.
about the DACA, and then we're going to
Yeah.
ask
Okay.
Laura to speak. She has to leave.
Okay, sorry.
That's all good.
Yeah.
We can go back to it after.
Okay. So DREAM-ACT was introduced, originally, I don't
2001.
2001. Okay. I personally remember the 2010 DREAM-ACT because I helped to organize for that, and it failed to pass the Senate by 5 votes. It passed the House, so 2011, like I think immigrant youth voices start to become stronger. We start to organize more. We start to talk about these issues even during years that the DREAM-ACT is not being talked about. And we start winning smaller victories in 2011. Actually, we organized and we got the California DREAM-ACT passed, which allowed undocumented students to get public financial aid and private scholarships in California. But also after the DREAM-ACT failed. So before the DREAM-ACT failed, we had SB 1070 in Arizona, and that led to a lot of protests all throughout the country just because it racially profiles groups. I remember on TV they asked the governor, what does an undocumented immigrant look like? And she couldn't even answer that because that's basically the law. Like, if you reasonably suspect someone to be here unlawfully, you have the right to detain them. And it's like, how can you tell just by looking at someone? Because clearly immigration, undocumented immigration is not just a Latino issue. It affects everyone. So in leading up to DACA's announcement in 2012, there was like a string of deportations. Actually, I mean, deportations were happening already, but under Obama's administration, the most deportations have been happening more than any of the presidents combined, like all of the past presidents. And so I remember several families of the students who are in the Aspire, the Parents and Undocumented Advocacy Group. They were in deportation proceedings. Some of them had deportation orders. And one thing that immigration attorneys knew was that immigration customs and enforcement have the power to do is to grant them relief on a case-by-case basis. And so they're able to grant them something called deferred action, which meant that their case was, they weren't going to be deported. And I don't remember if it allowed them to work here too, if it gave them work authorization, but it did defer their deportation cases. And so just before the announcement again, 90 law immigration professors wrote a letter to Obama stating like these are the things you can do as president, and one of them was listing you can grant deferred action, you have the power to grant that. Also for humanitarian reasons, you can grant TPS, temporary protected status, which is something like that has. I think folks from Haiti have that when the earthquake hit, so that was something. And there was a third thing that Obama could do that I can't remember what that was at the moment. And so just like think the increase in deportations had gotten a lot of the undocumented immigrant community out of the shadows and just kind of organizing and fighting these deportations, engaging in a lot of civil disobedience. And so in June, I think 15, 2012, that's when Obama made the announcement that he would grant deferred action, and that, I mean, was just controversial in so many ways because Republicans would come out and say, oh, this is unconstitutional. He's circumventing Congress by passing a law. He's technically not passing a law, he's doing something that he does have the authority to do based on, you know, his powers as president. And DACA was already something that, because it's an executive order, could be undone with any president, as we've just seen. And so